Ladies and gentlemen, the American frontier was not just a stretch of land. It was a proving ground for courage, resilience, and innovation. In this vast and often perilous expanse, survival was never guaranteed. Every tree line could conceal danger. Every journey westward was a gamble. In this world, the firearm became more than just a tool. It was a lifeline, a companion, and sometimes a judge and executioner. Our story begins with the humble flintlock musket. The flintlock musket was the quintessential firearm of early American settlers, trappers, and soldiers during the initial phases of westward expansion. Emerging in the late 17th century and dominating the 18th and early 19th centuries, it represented a revolutionary step in firearm technology at the time. Yet by modern standards, the flintlock was primitive, slow, cumbersome, and deeply unreliable under certain conditions. Still, for the men and women braving the wild unknowns of the American frontier, it was often the only defense they had. These muskets worked by using a piece of flint to strike a steel frizzen, creating sparks that ignited gunpowder in an external pan, which then set off the main charge in the barrel. The process was delicate and time-consuming. Under ideal conditions, a skilled shooter could fire maybe 2 to 3 rounds per minute, if everything went smoothly. But the frontier was rarely ideal. Wet weather could dampen the powder, rendering the firearm useless. Wind could blow away the priming charge. A worn flint or a poorly maintained lock mechanism could cause misfires, sometimes at the worst possible moments. Despite these limitations, the flintlock was a tool of survival. It was used not just in defense against threats, but for hunting the game that sustained entire families. Settlers relied on these guns to bring down deer, wild turkey, and even bison. Every shot counted, and there was no room for error. The time it took to reload, a painstaking process of pouring powder, ramming down a lead ball with a rod, priming the pan, cocking the hammer, and aiming again, meant that the shooter had only one real chance to make it count. Ownership of a flintlock was also a symbol of self-reliance. It wasn't just about having a weapon. It meant you could feed yourself, defend your homestead, and assert a measure of control over the wild world around you. In regions where law enforcement or military protection was minimal or non-existent, the musket was the law. It offered settlers a sense of power and agency in a land that was still largely untamed. Even the sound of a flintlock, the thunderous crack followed by a cloud of smoke, became part of the auditory landscape of the early frontier. It signaled hunting success, a warning to intruders, or the beginning of a desperate last stand. Black powder and lead balls were as much a part of the settler's toolkit as an axe or a plow. The flintlock musket also played a major role in shaping early American military engagements. From the French and Indian War to the American Revolution, militias and frontier soldiers wielded these weapons in battles that would define the trajectory of the emerging nation. Veterans of these conflicts brought their experience westward, and with them, their flintlocks, helping to spread both the weapon and the knowledge of how to use it across the expanding frontier. While the flintlock musket symbolized a vital technological step forward, it came with a host of limitations that often turned survival into a gamble. For all its importance on the frontier, early firearms were plagued by mechanical frailty, environmental sensitivity, and operational complexity. These flaws weren't just inconveniences. They could be life-threatening in the high-stakes world of the American wilderness. One of the most persistent problems with flintlocks and other early firearms was their extreme vulnerability to weather conditions, particularly moisture. A single drop of rain could soak the powder in the pan, rendering the gun unable to fire. Snow, humidity, or even the condensation from a cold barrel could interfere with the ignition process. Settlers quickly learned to keep their powder dry, literally. But despite their best efforts, many faced moments where their weapon failed in a critical instant. This made encounters with hostile wildlife or attackers far more dangerous, where a misfire could mean the difference between life and death. Misfires and flash in the pan failures were common. The flint had to strike the steel at just the right angle and with sufficient force to create a spark strong enough to ignite the priming powder. Even then, the flame from the priming pan had to travel through a small touch hole to ignite the main powder charge inside the barrel. Any obstruction, moisture, or poor craftsmanship could cause this delicate sequence to fail. When it did, The result was often just a weak fizzle or a puff of smoke. No bullet, no second chance. Reloading was another immense challenge. Early firearms required a long, multi-step reloading process, measuring and pouring black powder down the barrel, placing a lead ball, ramming it down tightly with a rod, priming the external pan with finer powder, and finally cocking the hammer. This process could take 20 to 30 seconds under calm conditions, but much longer under stress. In a chaotic situation, being charged by an enemy or a bear, there was usually only time for one shot before the shooter had to rely on a secondary weapon like a knife or tomahawk. Accuracy was another issue. Most early muskets were smoothbore, lacking rifling inside the barrel to spin the bullet and stabilize its flight. This meant that shots beyond 50 to 75 yards were often wildly inaccurate. Skilled frontiersmen could adjust for this with experience and keen instincts, but precision shooting was generally unreliable at long range. For hunting or self-defense, this limited effectiveness and often required closer and riskier encounters with the target. Additionally, the maintenance of early firearms was a constant concern. Black powder left behind a thick, corrosive residue after each shot. Without regular cleaning, barrels would foul and become harder to load or even dangerous to fire. In the wilderness, where resources and time were limited, properly caring for a firearm required discipline and knowledge that not every settler possessed. A neglected gun might work one day and explode in the user's hands the next. Compounding all these issues was the weight and bulk of the weapon. Flintlocks were long, heavy, and cumbersome to carry, especially over rough terrain. Ammunition, powder horns, and cleaning tools added even more to the load, making mobility a constant trade-off with preparedness. These weapons demanded skill, patience, and experience. They rewarded the calm and the careful, and punished the panicked and the untrained. Carrying a flintlock wasn't just about owning a weapon. It meant understanding it intimately, knowing its quirks, and respecting its limits. Every shot was a calculated risk, every engagement a test of both nerves and knowledge. The introduction of the percussion cap ignition system in the early 19th century marked a profound turning point in the evolution of frontier weaponry. Though it may appear a modest innovation on the surface, a simple copper cap filled with shock-sensitive explosive material, it fundamentally reshaped how firearms were used, maintained, and trusted on the American frontier. This small mechanical change brought enormous practical improvements over the older flintlock systems, transforming not only the design of firearms, but also the very confidence frontiersmen had in their weapons. The flintlock's reliance on an open pan of powder and a spark meant that misfires were common, especially in wet or humid conditions. Rain, snow, fog, or even morning dew could render the firearm useless. The percussion cap system solved this problem with remarkable efficiency. Instead of relying on an exposed powder pan, it used a sealed ignition system. The shooter would place a small cap over a nipple at the rear of the barrel. When struck by the hammer, this cap detonated, sending a flame directly into the main powder charge through a narrow channel. The result was a vastly more reliable and weather-resistant ignition, one that could be counted on in rain, cold, and wind. This shift in ignition technology also allowed for quicker, more confident shooting. No longer did frontiersmen have to worry as much about the delicate mechanics of flint, steel, and powder alignment. The percussion system was simple and consistent. With fewer parts to wear down or misalign, it reduced the mechanical failure rate dramatically. For those living on the edge of the American wilderness, this was more than a convenience. It was a potential lifesaver. A misfire during a hunting expedition or a defensive encounter could mean starvation or death. The percussion cap offered peace of mind that the weapon would fire when it mattered most. Another major benefit of the percussion system was its compatibility with more compact and innovative firearm designs. The flintlock mechanism had certain physical constraints that limited how firearms could be shaped and engineered. The percussion system, being smaller and more enclosed, allowed gunsmiths to develop sleeker, shorter-barreled, and more powerful firearms, from hunting rifles to military carbines and pistols. This flexibility paved the way for a new generation of weapons that were not only more effective, but also easier to carry and maintain across the rough, often mountainous terrain of the frontier. The reliability of percussion caps also improved the speed of follow-up shots. While reloading still required pouring powder and ramming down a lead ball, the elimination of the priming pan step shaved valuable seconds off the process. For seasoned marksmen, this meant a slightly faster rate of fire and more control during tense situations. In skirmishes or hunting scenarios, that improved reloading efficiency could spell the difference between success and disaster. Moreover, the percussion cap system was easier to teach and master. Unlike flintlocks, which required finesse in handling flints, adjusting pans, and maintaining spark-generating surfaces, the percussion method was straightforward and user-friendly. This accessibility helped democratize firearm use among settlers, travelers, traders, and even soldiers, many of whom had little formal training but needed to be combat-capable in a moment's notice. From a manufacturing perspective, the simplicity of the percussion lock also made it easier to mass-produce standardized firearms, which meant that weapons became more available and more affordable. As the American population surged westward during the mid-19th century, the percussion cap system helped arm a growing nation. Farmers, ranchers, prospectors, and pioneers could now own firearms that were dependable and modern, helping to fuel the spirit of independence and self-reliance that defined frontier life. One of the most significant technological leaps in the evolution of American frontier weaponry came with the adoption and refinement of rifling. The process of carving spiral grooves inside a gun barrel to spin the bullet as it travels. This simple yet transformative innovation dramatically increased the accuracy, range, and effectiveness of firearms and redefined the role of the frontiersman as both a hunter and a marksman. Early smoothbore muskets, while functional for close-range engagements and large volleys in warfare, were notoriously inaccurate. The lack of internal spin meant that the projectile often wobbled unpredictably through the air, limiting effective targeting to within about 50 to 75 yards. For settlers depending on precision to hunt game or defend a homestead with limited ammunition, this was a serious limitation. A missed shot could mean a lost meal, a wounded animal, or an enemy escaping with their life. The introduction of rifled barrels changed this equation entirely. The spiral grooves caused the projectile, typically a lead ball or later, a conical bullet, to spin along its axis, much like a well-thrown football. This spin stabilized the bullet's flight, vastly improving accuracy and extending the effective range of the firearm to 200 yards or more. Suddenly, frontiersmen could engage targets at greater distances with confidence, using fewer bullets and taking fewer risks. Nowhere was the impact of rifling more apparent than in the development of the long rifle, also known as the Kentucky or Pennsylvania rifle. Developed in the 18th century and reaching prominence in the early 19th century, these rifles became the hallmark of skilled hunters, scouts, and sharpshooters across the American frontier. With their long barrels and finely tuned rifling, these guns were not designed for rapid fire, but for precision. A trained marksman could take down a deer from over 150 yards or hit a man-sized target from distances that smoothbores couldn't even dream of reaching. This increase in accuracy did more than enhance hunting and defense. It influenced military tactics, too. During the Revolutionary War and into the Civil War era, units of American riflemen, many trained in the backwoods with rifled weapons, proved devastatingly effective against enemy officers and scouts. Their ability to pick off targets from long range shifted the dynamics of battle and offered a new level of tactical advantage to American forces. For the average settler, however, rifled firearms were not just instruments of war. They were personal tools, often passed down through generations. Rifled rifles required more careful loading than smoothbores. The tight fit between bullet and barrel meant greater force was needed to ram the projectile down, slowing the reload process. But this was a trade-off many were willing to make for the unparalleled accuracy. In the quiet forests, open plains, and rolling hills of the frontier, where every shot counted and ammunition was a precious commodity, making that shot count the first time was critical. Moreover, the psychological effect of increased accuracy cannot be overstated. With a rifled weapon in hand, a settler could operate with a sense of control and certainty, even in unpredictable wilderness conditions. A skilled shooter could confidently approach a game trail or defend a cabin, knowing their bullet would likely land where they aimed it. It elevated the firearm from a crude tool of survival to an instrument of precision, allowing its wielder to act with strategic intent rather than mere desperation. Rifling also laid the foundation for further innovation. As bullet shapes evolved from round balls to elongated conical mini-balls and beyond, the spin imparted by rifling became even more effective, enabling greater ballistic performance at longer distances. This paved the way for modern firearms development and set the stage for the repeating rifles and long-range sharpshooter weapons that would follow. As the American frontier expanded deeper into uncharted territory, so too did the demands placed upon the weapons wielded by settlers, scouts, soldiers, and lawmen. By the mid-19th century, the introduction of repeating firearms marked a monumental shift, not only in the mechanics of weaponry, but in the very rhythm of life and conflict on the frontier. No longer was a frontiersman bound to the limitations of a single-shot firearm that required meticulous reloading between every discharge. With the rise of repeating rifles and revolvers, the equation changed dramatically. Firepower could now be unleashed rapidly, with devastating effectiveness, fundamentally altering hunting, warfare, and daily survival. The earliest breakthroughs in repeating technology came with revolver pistols, such as Samuel Colt's iconic designs. Colt's patent in the 1830s introduced a rotating cylinder capable of holding multiple charges, usually 5 or 6, that could be fired in quick succession before needing to reload. This innovation revolutionized close-quarters defense and combat. A man who previously had only one shot in a pistol now had a handful. This drastically improved personal safety, especially in the lawless and often violent regions of the West. It allowed lawmen to face down outlaws with confidence and travelers to defend themselves more effectively against sudden threats. But it was the repeating rifle that truly transformed the landscape of the frontier. Unlike earlier rifles that had to be reloaded after each shot by pouring powder and ramming a bullet down the barrel, repeaters like the Henry rifle and later the Winchester Model 1873 utilized lever-action mechanisms and self-contained metallic cartridges, a game-changing development in firearm engineering. The shooter could now fire multiple rounds in rapid succession simply by working a lever. In the case of the Henry, that meant 16 rounds, an almost unimaginable upgrade compared to the single-shot muzzleloaders of just a generation earlier. These repeaters were more than just weapons. They were symbols of modernity and efficiency. For buffalo hunters, a lever-action rifle meant faster and more accurate culling. For settlers defending their homesteads from bandits or hostile forces, the ability to send out a stream of bullets in seconds offered a sense of security that older firearms could never provide. Soldiers on the frontier, often outnumbered and outmaneuvered by native forces in unfamiliar terrain, came to value repeaters for their sustained fire and reliability under pressure. Additionally, the rise of the repeater coincided with the development of metallic cartridges, which replaced loose powder and lead balls with compact, self-contained rounds. These cartridges were not only more resistant to moisture and easier to carry, but they also enabled much faster and more reliable reloading. With a belt full of cartridges and a lever-action repeater in hand, a frontiersman was now equipped with continuous firepower that could be maintained even under stress. This abundance of firepower didn't just change the dynamics of individual encounters. It began to reshape the very nature of strategy and confrontation in the American West. Ambushes, skirmishes, and even standoffs now unfolded differently. Where previously timing, stealth, and that first shot were everything, now there was room for prolonged engagements. A lone defender with a repeating rifle could hold off multiple attackers. Groups of cavalry armed with repeaters could turn the tide of battle with sheer volume of fire. The pace of conflict had accelerated. Furthermore, the repeater's intuitive and relatively simple operation meant that even those without extensive training could become effective shooters. The lever-action system became so iconic and beloved that it earned the nickname, the gun that won the West, a testament not only to its technological excellence, but also to its cultural significance. It embodied the rugged independence, speed, and adaptability that characterized frontier life. These weapons, with their polished brass cartridges and sleek wooden stocks, were more than just functional tools. They were marks of progress. They bridged the gap between the old world and the new, offering their wielders a psychological edge, a sense of modern control over the unpredictable chaos of the wild frontier. The evolution of American frontier weapons had a profound and often tragic impact on the ongoing conflicts between settlers, soldiers, and the indigenous peoples of North America. Nowhere was the shift in firepower more consequential than in the long, violent saga of Native American resistance against westward expansion. As firearms advanced, from flintlocks to repeaters, the balance of power on the frontier increasingly tipped in favor of the expanding United States, not merely due to numbers, but because of technological supremacy. During the earliest stages of European colonization and frontier exploration, the firearms in use, primarily single-shot flintlocks, offered only a marginal advantage over traditional native weapons such as bows, arrows, spears, and tomahawks. In fact, native warriors often held the upper hand in mobility, tactics, and terrain knowledge. Their deep understanding of the land allowed them to carry out devastating ambushes and hit-and-run attacks with great effectiveness. Flintlocks, with their slow reload times and unreliable ignition, were not always superior in close-quarter encounters. A skilled archer could lose several arrows in the time it took a settler to reload and fire one shot. However, as firearms technology progressed through the 19th century, particularly with the introduction of percussion caps, rifling, and repeating arms, the dynamic began to change rapidly. The percussion cap made firearms more reliable in adverse weather, eliminating one of the key disadvantages frontiersmen faced. Rifling enabled more accurate, longer-range shooting, making it possible for settlers and soldiers to engage native warriors from distances at which bows were ineffective. The most profound shift, however, came with the rise of repeating rifles and revolvers that allowed users to fire multiple shots without reloading. This newfound firepower disrupted traditional Native American combat strategies, many of which relied on speed, surprise, and the expectation that an enemy would be temporarily defenseless after a single discharge. With repeaters like the Henry rifle or the Winchester 1873, settlers and troops could now deliver sustained volleys of fire, neutralizing the brief window in which native forces previously launched effective counterattacks. Suddenly, a handful of defenders armed with modern weapons could hold off a numerically superior force that had once posed a grave threat. Additionally, the military began to equip cavalry units with repeaters, changing the dynamics of mobile warfare. Mounted U.S. troops armed with carbine-length repeating rifles could outgun and outlast their adversaries on horseback, whereas earlier soldiers had struggled to keep pace with highly mobile native forces. Campaigns during the Indian Wars increasingly featured technologically advanced U.S. units squaring off against indigenous fighters who, despite their skill, were often outmatched by the sheer volume and range of modern gunfire. This asymmetry wasn't just technological, it became logistical as well. Settlers and U.S. forces had access to factories producing mass quantities of ammunition and weapons, while native tribes, even when they obtained guns through trade or capture, frequently suffered from limited access to ammunition and spare parts. As the Industrial Revolution churned out ever more lethal weapons, native resistance became harder to sustain, not because of lack of will, but due to an ever-widening gap in access to the tools of war. The tragic irony is that many Native American warriors did adopt firearms and became skilled marksmen in their own right. Tribes like the Comanche, Sioux, Cheyenne, and Apache integrated captured or traded guns into their arsenals with impressive effectiveness. But as the 19th century wore on, the technological ceiling kept rising. What had once been a more balanced fight in terms of arms slowly turned into a one-sided struggle, in which the U.S. military's increasingly advanced weaponry overwhelmed even the most courageous and tactically adept native resistance. In broader terms, the evolution of frontier firearms didn't just affect individual battles. It influenced the entire trajectory of westward expansion. Each innovation in firearm technology made it easier for settlers to push further into indigenous lands with the confidence that they could protect themselves. Homesteaders who might have hesitated to settle in remote or contested areas now felt emboldened by the power they carried in their rifles. Military expeditions ventured deeper into hostile territory, knowing that their firepower could give them a decisive edge. The evolution of firearms on the American frontier was not merely a story of metal, mechanisms, and ballistics. It became a central thread in the very fabric of American identity. As settlers, soldiers, and pioneers moved westward, the weapons they carried weren't just tools of survival or instruments of war. They became powerful symbols of freedom, self-reliance, and manifest destiny. Over time, these weapons transcended their physical function and were woven into the mythology of the American West, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape cultural narratives, historical memory, and national identity to this day. In the collective imagination, the flintlock musket, the Kentucky rifle, and later the Colt revolver and Winchester repeater came to represent more than just technological progress. They embodied the rugged spirit of the frontier. They were the tools of legendary figures, Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Wild Bill Hickok, and Buffalo Bill. Men who, in folklore and dime novels alike, stood tall against the wilderness and the unknown, often with a trusted weapon at their side. These arms became extensions of the individual, portraying the gunman not as a mere warrior, but as a symbol of control, justice, and resilience in a lawless land. The phrase, "the gun that won the West," is more than clever marketing. It reflects how deeply certain firearms became entwined with the mythos of frontier conquest. The Winchester Model 1873, for example, was not just praised for its reliability and capacity. It became a badge of honor, a weapon so iconic it was featured in countless Western films, turning into a cinematic archetype as enduring as the cowboy himself. In Hollywood's golden era, the repeating rifle and revolver were inseparable from the imagery of wide-brimmed hats, dusty trails, saloon standoffs, and high-noon duels. Through film, literature, and popular culture, the firearms of the frontier took on an almost legendary status, their metal frames imbued with the values, both real and imagined, of the American experiment. But this symbolism wasn't just constructed in hindsight. Even in their own time, these weapons were seen as emblems of progress. In the 19th century, as America underwent rapid industrialization, the mass production of rifles and revolvers represented the technological prowess of the young nation. Firearms like the Colt and Winchester were among the first products to be built with interchangeable parts, setting the stage for modern manufacturing. Owning a high-quality firearm wasn't just a necessity. It was a source of pride, a sign that one was equipped to face the frontier's dangers and carve out a place in an unforgiving land. Furthermore, these weapons played a pivotal role in shaping perceptions of American exceptionalism. They were seen as equalizers, tools that allowed individuals to overcome great odds, defend liberty, and claim autonomy. In this sense, the gun was not just a weapon but a democratic symbol, granting even the lone traveler or impoverished settler the ability to protect what was theirs. This idea, romanticized and replicated for generations, helped foster a national ethos rooted in individual strength, determination, and the right to bear arms. Even today, the legacy of frontier firearms persists in American politics, cultural debates, and national identity. The reverence for the Old West and its iconic guns continues to fuel discussions around the Second Amendment, self-defense, and national heritage. Museums display frontier-era weapons not only as artifacts of war, but as milestones of invention and perseverance. Collectors and enthusiasts cherish antique rifles and revolvers, seeing in them the echoes of a past defined by adventure, risk, and reinvention. Perhaps most telling is how these firearms have retained their place in American storytelling. From John Wayne and Clint Eastwood to modern video games and reenactments, the weapons of the American frontier continue to fascinate new generations. They serve as powerful visual and thematic anchors in narratives about justice, survival, and the forging of a nation. In every gleaming lever-action rifle or weathered six-shooter lies a story, not just of combat, but of migration, identity, and transformation.